The North American Society for the Psychology of Sport and Physical Activity, NASPSPA, will celebrate its 50th anniversary in June of 2017. As part of the celebrations, it was decided that we would interview the previous distinguished scholars. My name is Penny McCullough, and today we will be chatting with Dr. Karl M. Newell. Through 2016, NASPSPA has named 24 distinguished scholars. Dr. Newell was named a distinguished scholar in 2002. This interview is being conducted in February of 2017. Good afternoon, Karl. Dr. Newell, how are you today?
I'm good, thank you.
Great. So tell us a little bit about your academic background.
Well, I hail from England originally and went to grammar school as a schoolboy before going on to what was then Loughborough College, now Loughborough University, for undergraduate work in physical education. So I was trained to be a teacher of physical education and a teacher of mathematics, and I think really it's at Loughborough that the formative interests I have in human movement were really nurtured, if you will. I think while I was an undergrad student, I had a sense that I was interested in research, although I didn't really quite know what it was. And started to look to graduate programs in the United Kingdom. But when you don't have a bachelor's degree, it's tough to move on to an official master's degree. So, like a number of people, which was officially called the Brawn Drain, I came to the United States after teaching for 2 years to enter graduate school at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So I came to do a master's degree. I really didn't know what it was I wanted to do or what my specialties might be. But Illinois was a great university, and still is, of course. And the department was a very large one and successful one. And I was very lucky to get an assistantship to go there. And I would say that taking that move to Illinois really changed my life in many ways. And I'm very appreciative to Illinois for that and many other things. So having thought about the master's degree, one quickly realizes, the question comes up, what are you going to do after that? And it seemed to me a master's degree wasn't going to get me very far on anything. So I stayed on at Illinois to do a doctoral degree. And through those early years of graduate school, I clearly became interested in more behavioral, psychological aspects of human movements. But towards the end, gravitated towards motor learning really as my point of emphasis. And that's really what I did for my doctoral dissertation, and it sort of moved me through my career to today. I was very lucky to be involved with Illinois because they had a strong emphasis in behavioral psychological research in physical activity in a variety of ways, and they still do. And this was the time of the Motor Performance and Play Research Laboratory, which I think is now defunct, but it did a lot to stimulate research in this area and produced a lot of significant scholars at that time. I was very lucky to be around there at the time of faculty members like Mike Ellis, Mike Wade, Rainer Martins, Dan Landers. It was an exciting time, and I was lucky to be part of that as a student, and then in fact to come back a year later on the faculty at the University of Illinois.
Great, thank you.
Sorry, go on.
Okay, your distinction of becoming a distinguished scholar of NASPSPA recognizes your long-standing contributions to the areas represented by your research. We'd now like you to share some of your thoughts on your scholarly endeavors. What sort of research interests did you have early on, and did you continue to pursue that line? If you changed your line, tell us a little bit about how all that happened.
Well, my research interest really, I think, began properly at the University of Illinois, and as I said, I moved into the area of what was then and still is now, I would say, called motor learning. I think what has changed is the orientation I have to that, the methods I use, the analysis I use, but in the main, I'm pretty much interested in the same kinds of questions today as I was way back then as a graduate student at Illinois. So in some ways, you know, I'm doing the same thing. I'm just doing it a little differently, and that's an important distinction. But I haven't really shifted areas at all. I've broadened out my own interests to some degree, but I'm still fundamentally very much interested in, you know, sort of the integration of these somewhat distinct areas of motor learning, motor control, motor development, and really biomechanics. So I try to work within those lines of scholarship and orientations to study problems in motor learning and control. You know, like most people in learning, if you're interested in learning, you're interested in what it is that's learned, or trying to come to terms with that question, and how people learn. And those are still standard sort of lines of questions that are there today for people to pursue.
Okay, you told us a little bit, but do you want to tell us, like, maybe a couple of basic research questions or underlying issues behind your research, or maybe a recent research in what you're trying to specifically learn?
Well, I mean, originally, way back with my dissertation, as I said, my dissertation study was really around Jack Adams's closed-loop theory of motor learning, his very influential 1971 paper. And this sort of allowed one to look at what he called the two-trace problem of motor control, had a recall and recognition mechanism. And while his theory was geared towards slow, graded movements, as he liked to call it, which emphasize closed-loop control in a sense, I and Dick Schmidt early on tried to broaden this out to more rapid ballistic movements, which allowed a cleaner separation in some ways of recall and recognition and how knowledge of results influenced those kinds of mechanisms. So that was the focus of my dissertation work, and was for you know, a few years after that when I came back to the United States on the faculty. You know, more recently, I mean, I think I was strongly influenced by an important paper, Kugler-Kelso-Turvey, 1980, and all the work that preceded that and has come since. And that really helped cement the idea of changing theoretical orientations from where I was, and got me thinking about new ways to look at the old problems. And, you know, here we are in, 2017, and I still think that paper was very influential for me, and I think it was for the field at large. Probably not given the credit today that it deserves, but it's still essential reading for me and my students. Out of that, I think, you know, I come strongly interested in issues of learning from the point of view of learning new patterns of coordination, how variability plays into that, how search processes play into that. Rather different approaches than what I was taking with Adams's paper in 1971. So as I said, I'm really still interested in the same old problems, so to speak, but certainly approaching them from a somewhat different point of view.
Thank you. So you've spoken a little bit about some other researchers that have influenced you, and you yourself have certainly had an abundance of your own research. If you think back, is there any particular project of your own that you're particularly proud of?
Well, it's an interesting question. You know, people focus a lot on citation analysis and impact factors, and I raise that because I'm not sure that I'm most proud of the paper that's probably cited the most. I think the other part of it is I tend not to look backward. I'm always looking forward. In other words, once something's done, you move on, and you know, you're looking to change and move ahead. But I would say that, you know, the work I've been doing the last 15 years on the acquisition of coordination from a dynamical systems point of view is probably of strong interest to me still, and I think at the end of the day will, you know, prove to have a lasting impact. And I'm certainly pleased with that line of research that we're doing, and currently even with sort of the switch to whole body movement and multiple degrees of freedom, I think from the point of view of physical activity and movement, that's where the action needs to be. So I'm still changing and moving, and we'll see where it goes.
That's super. Thank you. So you've had a long history of involvement with NASPA. Tell us a little bit about that, and then maybe also recall when you were named Distinguished Scholar of NASPA and what that meant to you.
Well, NASPA's been very important to me, and it's actually the case that the first independent meeting of NASPA was in 1973 at Atherton Park at the University of Illinois, and that was the time period I was just taking my finals and graduating with my PhD. In fact, my PhD exam, I think, was one day before NASPA. So I linked these together, you know, in a temporal way. But I was also involved with Mike Wade and Rainer Martins in helping to organize that meeting. So I had a strong attachment to NASPA from the beginning. I think I've only missed about 2 or 3 meetings since 1973. I try to go with regularity. I have encouraged my students to participate, and I think it's been very important for the field at large and very important for the behavioral science aspects of kinesiology. And I think that the fact that we had our largest attendance last year in Montreal speaks to the continued growth and development, and that's, I think, very, very pleasing. So for me, NASPA has been a central meeting. Of course, many of us move off to other societies with different emphases and so on, but I've always come back to NASPA, and it's played a very important role in my life, and I hope that it does for the future scholars of the area, and I'm sure it will. I think that you know, there's always the evolution of a field and evolution of the governing bodies and how societies play a role. But I think for the people with a behavioral science emphasis, NASPA is very important and needs to be sustained. And I trust that all the younger people out there are working hard and thinking about how they're going to contribute to make that work. Of course, I did, you know, presented many times, many papers at NASPA. I was president of NASPA. I've organized, you know, one year the conference of NASPA. So, you know, I've done most of the elements of being a member of NASPA over the years, and I will be attending the upcoming meeting in San Diego.
Super. We hope to see a lot of the distinguished scholars at that one. That would be nice to have many of you together at that one. Dr. Newell, do you have any other thoughts you'd like to share with us about where the field's going or what's happening, or just general thoughts for young scholars? Anything you'd like to share?
Well, as I've indicated, I think that the subcomponents of NASPSPA, obviously relate most strongly to the discipline of psychology, but there's strong efforts to integrate beyond behavioral science aspects to incorporate biological science aspects, and I think NASPSPA is going to have to face some decisions about how it wants to work with that. On the other hand, certainly there's a good number of societies that people with biological interests can move to, but I think ultimately there's going to be more integration across these boundaries that are separate to varying degrees with certain kinds of questions. So I'm guessing there's going to be more integration, and I think NASPSPA is going to have to think about how it wants to handle that. But it's actually, I think, in-house, there's probably a little more integration today around sports psychology, motor development, motor learning, and motor control than there has been, and that's healthy, and I think it needs to continue. So for me, I think NASPSPA is very important to the field, and people with a behavioral emphasis need to support it, because ultimately what we get out of this is only a matter of what we all put into it. And certainly it's just amazing to me that my first NASPSPA was 1973.
Well, thank you very much for your thoughts this afternoon, Dr. Newell. And thank you for your contributions over the years to NASPSPA and your recognition as being a distinguished scholar. And I'd like to just thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'll be in touch.
Okay, take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.